And now on 1FM, the story of sampling. Can you steal it? Presented by Pete Tong.
I'm talking about sampling records.
Well, in that case...
1, 2, 3,
Sampling is theft. It's as simple as that.
Pump up the volume.
It's perhaps been the most important technical innovation since Bob Dylan played the electric guitar at the Albert Hall.
Oh, yeah.
It's an empty box. You just put your imagination in there and play around with it.
We've had to cuff up a couple of times.
Over the last decade, sampling has become the buzzword in popular music. Any sound from a James Brown scream to a grand piano can now be recorded and reproduced using digital technology. But it's this very ability to create almost perfect copies that has made the sampler the most controversial musical instrument ever. In the past, musicians could copy the sound and style of another group or even take the occasional musical idea, but with a sampler, today's musicians can make a literal copy of someone else's work and add it to their own. For some, this so-called age of plunder is a dream come true. Instant access to that guitar lick or drum pattern it would take years to learn to play. But for others, it's a nightmare as they find their work being used without permission. But how did this situation come about? How have samplers evolved? Who is sampling who? And ultimately, is it legal? Prior to the arrival of digital technology, there was only one machine that could accurately recreate the sound of real instruments on a keyboard. Invented in the late 60s, the mellotron used a complicated system of loop tape recordings to achieve an effect similar to sampling. It proved particularly popular with progressive rock groups like the Moody Blues, who made use of it on their famous track Nights in White Satin. Genesis also favoured the mellotron's unique sound, and they featured it heavily on many of their classic early 70s albums. Tony Banks, Genesis keyboard player, recalls using the machine.
The first mellotron was a nightmare. It was never designed to go on the road. It was built as a sort of, I don't know what it was built as, really. It was built as the sort of thing they expected people to have in their sitting rooms, because it had all these rhythm sounds on it, bossa novas and everything, which you're supposed to play with one note, and then it had the string sounds, was just something to play along on the top of it. They didn't realise its application in the rock business at all. It was an extraordinary system. They involved bicycle chains and vacuum cleaner motors. It was a real Heath Robinson affair. And it had a sort of continuous drum of tape, which had all the different sounds one after the other on the tapes. So in order to spool to a new sound, you had to press a button and the whole system would spool on to the next position. And there was no way you could put your own sounds on that. It came with about 18 sounds, and then also had on the left-hand manual, it had lots of rhythm tracks and things, which were pre-recorded stuff. But the next instrument that came out about a year or two later, you had more flexibility. It was a much simpler instrument, just had 3 sounds on it, and you had a whole rack, and you take it out, and you put in a new rack for the 3 sounds. And there was some scope for your own sounds on that, although to be honest, nobody ever did it. You just took some of the factory sounds, but you could choose which factory sounds you had on your tape. And they introduced lots of better sounds as well. They had the voices, which was a radical new sound, I think. Probably almost the best of all the sounds they produced, just because suddenly you could bring in this whole bank of choir, you know, in the middle of a song when no one was expecting it. And the first time you used this kind of thing on stage, everyone was looking around for things that just weren't there, because obviously at that stage people were very used to the very specific sounds you got out of a rock group. It was guitar, drums, bass, and organs, really. That was about it, and piano sounds. So these sort of sounds like the mellotron was just unique, you know, a totally different sound for a stage group to get.
There's a fat old lady outside the saloon, laying out the credit card. She plays for tune. The deck is uneven right from the start, and all of their hands are playing a part. Captain leaves his arms right out through the night. Join the time for the run, and round tables talking down we go. To the show, up we go. We'll play the hobby horse, I'll play the fool. We'll tease the bull, round and round, round and round. For the run, with a twist of the world we go. For the run, till the goal is gold. Dancing out with the moon at night, nights in the green fields down and shout.
Dancing with the Moonlit Night from the Genesis album, Selling England by the Pound, with vocals by Peter Gabriel. In 1975, Gabriel left Genesis to pursue a solo career and greater musical freedom. With his interest in unusual sounds and instruments, he naturally followed developments in music technology. And in 1979, he became one of the privileged few to see a demonstration model of the world's first commercially available digital sampler, the Fairlight computer musical instrument. One of his collaborators at the time was cousin Stephen Payne, a keyboard player and expert in sound synthesis. He also saw the Fairlight CMI in action. Did it excite him?
Yes, it did, for a couple of reasons. First of all, one of the interests people had in analog synthesizers at that stage was trying to imitate acoustic sounds. Obviously, they were trying to generate new sounds as well, but the imitation of acoustic sounds was something that a lot of people been striving for a long time. So the Fairlight allowed us to get a very accurate reproduction of an acoustic sound. What it also meant was that we could take non-musical sounds and use them in a musical context. For example, percussion at that stage had been sounds which people could play with sticks, mallet instruments, that type of thing. We could now take any sort of sound, however non-musical it was, and use it in a rhythmical context, and that was very exciting. Peter, as soon as it was powered up and running, started finding some bizarre sounds and trying to record them and seeing how they would work on the keyboard. So his interest from the beginning was trying to not necessarily invent sounds, because obviously if you're taking them from the acoustic world, they exist already, but his interest was to use those sounds in a very untypical way. Obviously there's a requirement with most people to generate good string and brass sounds and some good drum sounds, but that wasn't his primary interest with the CMI in the early days.
Despite the enormous price tag on the machine, Gabriel decided to invest in one, and it was first used briefly on the album Peter Gabriel 3. However, it wasn't until his fourth album that the instrument's capabilities were more fully explored.
Peter and I spent a long time making what we considered to be original sounds for that album specifically. They ranged from playable sounds to sound effects, and I think the Fairlight was probably used more on that record in a unique context as opposed to the context of simulating orchestral sounds than any other record that's ever been made. It was, and the flavour, the colour of the record was therefore very different to most other records. Probably the most famous sound, which has now been used on a lot of records, including film scores and other pop records, was one called Pit's Twang, which is a fairly low sound, a very big sound which starts with a crack and then becomes a boom. And that was made by recording a lot of different percussion instruments on different tracks on a multi-track tape recorder, mixing those just for that one beat and sampling that mixture into the Fairlight. It was then transposed down about 3 octaves and ended up being a sound that none of us had quite anticipated, but it was very exciting. And that sound was used as the main sound on Peter's track, Rhythm of the Heat.
Looking out the window, I see the red dust clear. High up on the red rock stands the shadow with the spear. The land here is strong, strong beneath my feet. It feeds on the blood, it feeds on the heat. The rhythm is below me, the rhythm of the heat. The rhythm is around me, the rhythm has control. The rhythm is inside me. The rhythm has my soul. the dust, the spirit enters into me, and I submit to trust.
Producer Trevor Horn was also amongst the first to invest in a Fairlight, and together with J.J. Jekzalek, Gary Langan and Ann Dudley, he formed the group The Art of Noise. Their early singles, Close to the Edit, Beatbox and Moments in Love, and their debut album, Who's Afraid of the Art of Noise, are milestones in sample-based music. Ann Dudley remembers her first encounter with the instrument.
The first thing we worked on, as far as I remember, on the Fairlight was a dollar record. And we used it to sample bits of Teresa Bazar's vocals. And I'd never done anything like that before, and suddenly there was the possibility of playing somebody's vocals on a keyboard. And suddenly, from Teresa singing "Ah," one was able to create a whole choir. And it suddenly sounded like the Vienna Boys Choir or something like that. And it opened up, just in that moment, it opened up a whole new world of possibilities. It suddenly seemed like the whole world of music and the whole world of making records had got a lot bigger, and there was going to be a lot of experimentation and almost too much to cope with in the next few years.
No, no, no.
It seemed obvious that for a group with a name, The Art of Noise, the Fairlight was the thing that we ought to be getting into, because it did give us the opportunity to make art out of noise. And Paul Morley had devised this name, The Art of Noise, from an earlier group of futurist musical experimenters, who, if they'd have had a Fairlight, and this was way back in the 1920s, would have been happy as sandboys, I'm sure, because they also experimented with external noises, factory sirens and massed choirs. They had the idea of making music out of industry.
With the Fairlight, The Art of Noise were able to fulfill the futurist dream by making music from any sounds they could record, including slamming doors and a car's starter motor.
We were very experimental. We weren't aiming to make hit records at all. Nobody was more surprised than me than when our first records were successful. We seemed to tap into something which we weren't aware existed, and suddenly people talked of us as a hip-hop group. And we were #1 in the black charts in America, and we were just messing around with a computer in Shepherd's Bush.
By the mid-80s, samplers had established their ability to generate copies of real instruments and sounds from nature. But only the occasional orchestra stab had actually been stolen from an already recorded source. It took hip-hop to popularize the idea of quoting significant parts from other records, especially so-called cut-up records like Grandmaster Flash's Adventures on the Wheels of Steel, which were composed entirely from existing vinyl. In the UK, Bill Drummond, former manager of Echo and the Bunnymen, joined forces with colleague Jimmy Corti to make a series of hip-hop-inspired audio collage records. They formed a group called the Jams, but are perhaps better known today as the KLF, responsible for the hits What Time Is Love and 3 AM Eternal. Drummond recalls his initial inspiration.
It was New Year's Day, the first day of 1987. I was at home with my parents. I was going for a walk in the morning. It was like bright blue sky. I thought, I'm going to make a hip-hop record. Who can I make a hip-hop record with? I wasn't brave enough just to go and do it myself, because although I can play the guitar and I can knock out a few things on the piano, I knew nothing personally about the technology. And I thought, I knew Jimmy, I knew he was a like spirit. We share similar tastes and backgrounds in music and things. So I phoned him up that day and said, let's form a band called the Justified Ancients of Moo. And he knew exactly, to coin a phrase, where I was coming from. And within a week, we had recorded our first single, which was called All You Need Is Love. And the whole thing was just to make music not using any instruments, just using bits and pieces, and do it as fast as we could. And not care about quality, really. I was just so tired of the traditional song, the well-crafted song, that for me, it becomes so boring, so lame, so tired. The electric guitar, it seemed like I used to, worship the electric guitar. And I'd begun to hate it. I'd begun to hate everything about it. I just loathed the whole history of rock music. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, most of the 80s. And suddenly there was this fresh black music from the States. And I just thought, that's what should be happening. Now, the rest should be dumped and forgotten about.
Sexual intercourse. No known cure.
We're back again, they never kicked us out. 20,000 years of shout. With a beatbox rhythm and a shipyard rhyme. With a hundred MCs on the river Clyde. Taxi. Southern Texas, 79. Killer vibes meet the world outside. Justified.
The Jam's first single, All You Need Is Love, utilising samples from the Beatles, Sam Fox and The Sound of Music to make a statement about the current AIDS crisis. And in terms of audio collage, it was undoubtedly a groundbreaking record. It also clearly flouted copyright law, and in its original form, no label or distributor would agree to touch it. Were Drummond and Corti surprised by the reaction to the record?
We didn't think that anybody would take notice of us. We thought it was going to be completely underground in one way, but at the same time I felt that there's a whole new generation. It's going to sound really patronising, but a whole new generation of people, young people, who are going to get used to working with the cheap computers, the cheap gear. They weren't going to want to know about You know, the electric guitar, all that image was just so old hat. They weren't going to be bothered about that. They're going to grab this gear and make these records and make this music. And I believed that was going to happen within 3 months. I thought everybody was going to be at my state of mind, you know.
The jams received an extremely positive reaction from the British music press, and encouraged by this, they set about recording their debut album 1987. However, within days of its release, they found themselves in serious trouble.
The track that caused all the problem on 1987 was a track called The Queen and I, which was totally based on ABBA's song Dancing Queen. On our multi-track, we recorded the complete version of Dancing Queen, and then we added everything else we wanted to add on top of it, and then we mixed it. We just mixed their track in and out, and they were completely and utterly horrified with what we'd done. They wanted it destroyed straight away. They wanted all copies that had been sold brought back in. They wanted us to get everything back. I mean, it was a complete impossibility. And we went to a lawyer to ask him his advice on this thing. I started reading all the legal stuff on copyright, all the copyright laws since they first developed in the 17th century. That's when they first came in. And then I basically sat down and started writing this whole thesis about the defense of what we were doing artistically and creatively, and that if machines are going to be invented like samplers, you can't stop them. It's like inventing the electric guitar and saying, well, I'm afraid you can't play them. It felt like all the acoustic guitarists were coming out with all these laws saying, afraid that's it, boys, you can't play the electric guitar. And it seemed that big to me at the time. Anyway, the ABBA case, our solicitor was saying, you're going to spend $20,000 trying to fight this in court and you're going to lose, which obviously we couldn't do. So our whole idea was to go over, meet up with Benny and Bjorn from ABBA, the two songwriters, and sit down with them, artist to artist, and sort of go through it. I felt that they had taken, they were singing in English for a start, which was like taking supposedly our language. They were taking a form that was American popular music, stroke British popular music, and making it into something their own and selling it back to the world. I just felt artistically there was no difference to what they were doing to what we were doing. I mean, it might sound a million miles apart, and they had the law on their side and not the law on our side. But I felt if we sat down with them, they would understand it, and I'm sure they would understand it. But their publishers just would have none of it. Their legal people would have none of it, and said, okay, well, we're going to come to Sweden, come to Stockholm and meet up with you. And they say, there's no point, you know, we won't allow you to come in. But we wanted to make that gesture, so we got the boat over, drove across Sweden, and we had all the remaining copies of our album with us that we were supposed to destroy. We got there at 3 a.m. in the morning, and obviously, you know, we were being totally stupid and getting it cost. They're not going to be there, but we knew they wouldn't meet us, but we wanted to make that statement. We had the gold album there with, presented to Benny, Bjorn and Stig, their manager, who was also co-writer of Dancing Queen, for sales in excess of 0 copies of our album. And so we left the album there for them, and we drove back. Early the next morning, we built a huge funeral pyre of all our albums, set them on fire, and drove back to London. And I know it's totally stupid, but we were into the whole thing of it at that time. You know, I didn't think it was our thing to liberate the grooves, but I just wanted to sort of state the case that what we were doing was artistically right. Even though I understood the laws, even though I understood why those laws had to be there to protect people from things, it just seemed we were in such a tight corner. What we were doing as the Jams wasn't dance music. It was something else. Although we'd been influenced by hip-hop and rap, we weren't attempting to make dance records. It was more the meaning of the tracks. Although they had to musically work together, it was more like a punk version, I suppose. Our early stuff was loved by the music papers because they could write about it, they could get all philosophical about what we were doing. The whole reason why one samples now is not for some sort of weird meaning or irony or that collage effect. It's more just to push the groove, to keep people moving.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance.
Undoubtedly, dance music has taken sampling on board far faster than any other musical genre. Dave Durrell manages many of Britain's top remixers and is a DJ and remixer himself. Does he consider sampling to have been an important innovation?
I think if you look at the 80s in terms of dance music and perhaps have a cut-off line around 1987, then it's perhaps been the most important technical innovation since Bob Dylan played the electric guitar at the Albert Hall. I think it's very, very important. I think it's given a whole generation of kids all around the world a chance to make music.
Durrell was responsible for the samples used in the Mars record Pump Up the Volume. It went to #1 in the UK chart and became the first widely known sample record to face litigation.
When we went to do the remix of the record and actually put on more elements, and I think that version became the most widely known version of the record, Stock Aitken and Waltman weren't too happy that we'd used a 4-second break from Roadblock, which was their current, big hit. It wasn't immediately recognisable, and I don't think anybody actually knew until we kind of mouthed off about it in the press, which was a bit of a mistake looking back. But fortunately we avoided the court, and there was a settlement out of court at a later date. But I think if we had gone to court, it would have been quite bad in terms of the future of a lot of the records that came straight after. S-Express, Bomb the Bass, Cold Cut, etc. all released very similar records at a very similar time. Would have caused untold trouble for them. Fortunately, because our one took so long to actually clear and sort out with Stock Aitken and Waltman, they all got away with it. We opened the door and they run through.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance, dance.
When the drum beats go like this.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance, dance.
Having faced litigation, does Durrell now believe there should be restrictions on the use of sampling?
There should be perhaps a limit to what you can do, but in terms of confining art, there is a certain element of art still somewhere in the music business, and I think you should be allowed to do that. Compare it to Warhol painting cans of soup, or Marilyn Monroe, or whoever. And I think sampling, if KLF want to go off and do, ABBA their way, let them do it, and if Chicone Youth want to do Madonna, let them do it. And I think you kind of eventually got to say, well, we're going to punish you for it, but put it out if you want, because it's a free world.
We can get paid in full.
So what exactly is the current legal position on sampling? Andrew Jenkins, head of Polydor's UK legal department.
Sampling is theft. It's as simple as that. The Copyright Act outlaws it, and you should get permission. A lot of people don't get permission. There are two different copyrights involved. There's the copyright in the sound recording and the copyright in the actual song. Now, up until quite recently, you were able to record a song once it was granted a first license. Now, under the new Copyright Act, you'll need to get permission from the publisher to record a song. There's no longer any free first license. If they use a sample, we have every right just to stop them putting the record out. if we find out about it.
But who actually decides whether a sample can be used or not?
We'd always go back to the original artist, wherever possible. I mean, obviously, with some artists, you've got no option other than to take that decision yourself, whether you think it's reasonable or not. You know, I think in the case of Jimi Hendrix, whose guitar solos are sampled a lot, we would say it's never acceptable. That was what he intended the record to be used for, and no other use. But with all other artists, we go back to them and say, look, this has happened. Do you approve of it first? Because I think far more importantly than whether the record company or artist earns any money about it is whether the sample's used in a way that doesn't detract from the original performance. After all, the artist has put a lot of work into it.
Does Jenkins believe there is sufficient legislation at present to deal with sampling cases?
There is legislation. The problem is there's no real penalty other than to take the other side to court. And that's always a problem. It's just not worth the expense and the time and effort of getting a legal system involved. I mean, if there were an automatic fine imposed, that would be probably a little bit easier. But it's just difficult to administer. There is actually legislation. There's no easy way of dealing with it, though. I think so. In some ways, we need to go back and re-educate the people who are making the records. And that's where the initiative seems to fall down. I think producers have an obligation when they're making records to make sure that if they use samples, they are getting permission.
But does Jenkins believe a time will ever come when people will stop sampling?
No, I don't see that people are ever going to stop using samples. I don't think we'll ever stop it. All we can do is try and police it and at least make sure that the artists get a chance to express their view over how their recording's being used.
To date, every sampling case has been settled out of court, but does Dave Durrell believe this situation will change?
I think it will. I think there'll be some interesting cases. I'm sure somebody's actually going to make a test case in the courts to prove something. I think everybody, De La Soul, Beastie Boys, all the big court cases to date that I can think of have actually all been settled outside of court, which obviously shows reluctance by the companies to accept a precedent, especially when you consider that MC Hammer, for instance, sold 7 million albums in the States or whatever. On You Can't Touch This, virtually the whole backing track was a massive loop from Rick James. And subsequently, you know, Rick James kind of woke up to this fact and his lawyers took MC Hammer and Capital EMI, I think, to the cleaners. But I think there's no way they're going to put a cap on it because it is obviously such financially lucrative business. I mean, especially in the areas of rap. I mean, house doesn't sell that big yet in the States, but I think in all forms of dance and most forms of rock as well now, I think, you know, you'll find kind of there are interesting samples, whether it be on Faith No More or Red Hot Chili Peppers. People are kind of dropping in bits and pieces of their fave records, no doubt about it.
Any minute now, Pop will eat itself.
Very much like scruffy pigs to look at. And they've got big knobbly warts and lumps all over their long, hairy faces.
Compared with dance acts, rock bands have been slow to explore the possibilities of sampling from other records. One of the first to do so were Pop Will Eat Itself, who firmly established the idea of combining guitars and samples on their debut album, Box Frenzy, released in 1987. Graham Crabb is responsible for much of the group's sampling. Why does he think it took so long for other bands to catch up?
I think there's a lack of credibility involved in it. Like, you've got your real music lobby, like perfect crafted songs, you know, and it's like anything that's taken is not a perfect crafted song. And I think it's through people being too precious and too uptight about their own music, you know. If you've got a bit of a looser attitude, you can see that you can just twist things and turn them into your own type of thing. And it definitely took people a long time to get round to thinking that way.
Blinkered vision. We steal outlines from television. Steal some words. Steal some tune. Don't be shy. It's the high-tech crew. We're little boys who tell stories. Fight that gossip with Jack and Norris. Tell no secrets. Give no clues. It's all here for us to use. Take a beatbox and add a garage racket. Go. Box Frenzy. We got lines fly like an eagle. The rhythm it smokes more than a beagle. Floating, butterfly, stinging, bees, the beat is fresh. The rhymes are free. take, we steal, we borrow, here today and gone tomorrow. The moment, grab those kicks, we're merry pranksters, what not tricks.
Pop Will Eat Itself's first album was full of blatant, tongue-in-cheek samples from a host of pop acts, including Adam and the Ants and Mel and Kim. But today they use sampling in a far more subtle way. Why have they changed direction?
Because I think that really could have just been novelty sampling. It was, you know, it was the first time we'd sort of been introduced to that. And it really had to progress from there, because if you're just trying to retread those same ideas of introducing naff bits of pop, I don't think it was going to impress anybody. So, like a lot of bands who get into sampling, like they do it for a bit and they say, oh, we sampled for a bit, but it's old hat now, which I don't think is the full story, because that's, you've either got to drop it or take it to newer heights, you know. And what we're doing now is taking very small bits of sound and building like a collage between them, or the riffs that we play are from very small stolen bits of sound, which we then build a riff out of, you know. Like the last album, it's probably 70% samples or something, but it'd probably be hard spot to find more than a dozen that you recognise.
So it's not potential legal problems that worry them?
It's not so much that. I just think that if you're going to deal in the sampling genre, you've got to show some kind of skill about it, because obviously people say it is easy to just take something and whop it in your song. So you've got to show a bit of artistry in between, you know, and twist it and turn it upside down and inside out and affect it and build your whole new thing out of something that's old.
Have Pop Will Eat Itself ever had any legal problems?
We've had to cough up a couple of times. Nothing too serious really, though. It's just something really for the lawyers to sort out. There was one bit in Can You Dig It, which was taken from some 70s naff B-side. The Undisputed Truth, they were called. And we just lifted the boom boom, chicka boom boom bit. Someone spotted that and got in touch with RCA. And I think they had to pay about $5,000 or something like that. Not too bad. We had to pay for the Twilight Zone as well, and had to credit it. But that's fair enough, you know. I mean, that was a straight lift. I mean, the Twilight Zone goes, and on our record it goes. So we can't complain about that. If you do a straight lift, you've got to accept that you may have to cough up for it.
Do Pop Will Eat Itself believe in approaching people before sampling them?
No, we always wait, because I think you're just giving them a chance to say no. And I think, anyway, you could ask somebody and end up paying for something which even the writer at the end of the day may not even recognise if you heard it, because you've altered it so much, you've put it in a different context and chopped it up, whatever. So I suppose if you're ideologically
Hip-hop has always taken elements from other records, but today sampling is absolutely critical to the music. Records old and new are scoured for unused breaks that will give a group the edge over the competition. New York-based duo Gang Starr have established their reputation with an original selection of samples, most notably from DJ Premier's large collection of jazz records.
The DJ's name is Premier, and I'm the guru. The DJ's name is Premier, and I'm the guru. Sampling, to me, is important if you style it to where it's more like an art instead of, some people oversample. They'll take a song and just mess it up. They'll sample like 4 bars of the song, and then it sounds just like the song that you heard originally before it was sampled.
And sometimes they use the same titles as the song.
I mean, I would sue too if I was an R&B artist or whatever, if somebody, took my stuff like that. But I like to make it an art form by styling the samples and disguising it to where it doesn't sound like the same sample that you hear when it's just a little piece.
Right, because you might find one break and then another that goes with it, and then you've got so many things weaving in and out that it's therefore it's an art form.
It's a song, a totally different song.
And I would like to play a little tune I just composed not so long ago.
Miss Billie Holiday.
Bird.
The music called jazz.
On the track Jazz Thing, Gang Starr combines sampling with live jazz musicians. Is this a way forward, especially as the number of unused records they can sample from must surely run out?
If I had to start playing instruments, I would play instruments because I know how to play. I know how to do that too. It's just that there's too many records out there to run out. I mean, I could get the weakest record and make it hype.
Plus, you can take breaks that have been used before and do them different.
Yeah, I could still take something that somebody used and twist it totally to where it won't sound the same.
Yeah, that's a thing too, showing different production techniques.
Yeah. You can get 5 producers the exact same records and tell them, put a song together and let's see who's the best. And some of them will come out with mediocre stuff, some of them will come out with something that doesn't even sound like what they...
It'll be way different, yeah.
Its roots are in the sounds of the African, or should I say the mother. Bringing us back again, from the Drummond on the Congo. Came with a strong flow, and continued to grow. Feet move to the beat of the tabalo. Now dig the story and follow. For then it landed on American soil. Through the sweat, the blood, and the toil. It praised the Lord, shouted on chain gangs, pain they felt, but it helped them to maintain. Scott Joplin grass, Bessie Smith blues, St. Louis blues, they were all the news, ringing smooth in all the listeners' ears, fulfilling the needs and planting the seeds of a jazz thing. King Oliver's group was a train coming through to Chicago, bringing in the New Orleans groove, and when Satchmo blew, the audience knew. Basin Street Blues was the whorehouse tune, it was music. Great to dance to, great to romance to, with a lot to say to you. Relaying a message, revealing the essence of a jazz thing.
Hip-hop has continuously evolved with changing technology, and it's possible to define distinct phases in the history of the music. But do Gang Starr believe it improved with the arrival of affordable samplers?
Yeah, there's a lot of good old records now, from back in the days, but I think it got much better with sampling. If you know how to sample right. I mean, like I said, there are a lot of people who make very terrible samples.
I think it got more interesting after everybody stopped using so much James Brown. You could still find James Brown stuff that hasn't been used or use it in a different way, but I'm just saying, it was a time when everybody was using James Brown.
Yeah, every record that came out was a James Brown record.
So, yeah, once it got beyond that, then it started to get funky.
1, 2, 3, 4, get it!
Jungle VIP. I've reached the top and had to stop, and that's what's bothering me. I wanna be a man cub, and stroll right into town, and be just like the other men. I'm tired of moving around.
Yes, the rhythm, the rebel. Without a pause, I'm lowering my level. The hard rhymer, where you never been, I'm in. You want styling? You know it's time again. D, the enemy, telling you to hear it. They praise the music, it's time to play the lyrics. Some say no to the album, the show, bum rush the sound. I made it
James Brown is undoubtedly the most sampled man in history, so how has his record label Polydor reacted? Andrew Jenkins.
Yeah, James Brown is quite an incredible situation. He is the most sampled artist, and we actually have a department in New York, 2 people working full-time on James Brown samples. They do nothing else. It's quite amazing. These people are checking records that are released, tracking down who's sampled James Brown and trying to get some sort of payment back to the artist for the sample, or trying to get the record stopped.
But how successful can they be?
They can never be 100% successful. They tend to concentrate on the successful records, the ones that people know about. I mean, George Michael recently said on British television that he sampled a James Brown track. Now that's a nice easy one. There's no 2 ways about it, really. But there are a lot of tracks that get released, I'm sure, with James Brown samples on them. Because they aren't successful, people just aren't aware of it. It still means that there's been an infringement of the copyright law.
But how does the man himself feel about sampling?
I think James Brown sees sampling as a sort of flattery, as we do tend to always get James Brown samples approved for a fee. He likes to be paid for it, but he doesn't seem to object based on any particular style of music, type of music, or whatever. He seems reasonably happy, once he's remunerated for it, to allow his samples to be on records.
Today, the majority of the most interesting and important new groups use sampling in one form or another. Some go back to recording original sounds from nature, while others continue to plunder from every available recorded source, whether it be James Brown's back catalogue or the BBC's own sound effects library. Hoodle and Priest are one of several new groups who see sampling as an integral part of their work. They use everything from film dialogue to classical recordings in the construction of their music. But does sampling still excite this new generation of musicians? Derek Thompson, founder member of Hoodle and Priest.
The possibilities of it do, for me personally. I'm not excited by a lot of what is being done with it. It's used by producers and engineers to be lazy. If you clock, you know, the happening groove from last week's record, you know you've got a happening groove for next week as well, and you can put something a little bit different on top of it, but it's just lazy. None of it interests me at all. Samplers, like, it's an empty box. You just put your imagination in there and play around with it. So, you know, before samplers, 90% of groups are rubbish anyway, you know, because nobody's got any imagination, and the same is still true. There's a lot more people that have access to doing records that they maybe couldn't have done, but it's only because they can appropriate somebody else's idea or groove. People are fixated on dance, you know, it's like it's used for nicking breakbeats and things like that, and there's a hell of a lot more you can do with it. There pretty much isn't anything you can't do with it.
Their first album features sampled dialogue from a number of films, including RoboCop, Hellraiser and Blade Runner. To what degree did the choice of samples inspire the music?
Innocence and peace depart.
It was a lot of it. A lot of the inspiration comes from the sample will come from a film, and the film is the inspiration for the track. So it did play quite a big part, but also it was important to me because I'm not a techno head. I don't sit there with loads of keyboards and stuff. I'm originally a guitarist, so I like the organic sort of input into it, and I use the sampler in a very basic way. Just use it like a guitar, plug it in, use its most basic functions, sample it, play it. That's how it's done.
Do Hoodle and Priest believe in contacting the relevant copyright holders before using a sample?
It depends whether you've got a major record deal or not. If you've got a major record deal, which we have, you tend to have to keep things secret from your legal department because they'll just tell you, no, we're not having that because we're going to get our ass sued off, you know, for it. So it just means you've got to be a bit more careful. We have had problems and we still have problems, but because it's a bit of a grey area and lawyers are not particularly interested in the creative possibilities or aspects of it, it's like, you know, well, where's my pound to flesh out? But I found that a lot of them don't even want the money. You know, we've approached some people who just didn't like the tone of what we were doing. You know, found it a little bit too subversive to want to put a corporate identity to. It's like, no, you can't have that, you can't use it. Whereas other people have been really cool, like used some Hellraiser samples, and they were totally into it. And they were like saying, well, actually, we haven't got anyone to do the soundtrack for Hellraiser 3. You know, they're very positive, you know. So, you know, you get mixed reactions, but I would say to people that we're gonna do it, just keep your mouth shut and do it.
Time to die. Time to die. I've seen things people wouldn't believe. Time to die.
done questionable things. Time to die. Time. Enough. Time to die. I've done questionable things, also extraordinary things. Revel in your time. Revel in your time.
The chance to begin again in a golden land of opportunity and adventure.
Open up your mind, time to relax. I'll take you on a journey way off the tracks. I created a devastating masterpiece. Back to the future with the hoodlum priest. Open up your mind, time to relax. I'll take you on a journey way off the tracks. I created a devastating masterpiece. Back to the future with the hoodlum priest.
Wake up. Time to die. Time to die. Wake up.
I've done questionable things.
Now come with me into my world where cities fly, cities fell. What went wrong? They dropped the bomb. Now yesteryear is dead and gone.
Wake up. Time to die. Time to die. Wake up.
The hoodlum priest.
Sampling is perhaps the most critical issue of debate amongst modern musicians, and many fear that the continuous theft of musical ideas can only lead to stagnation. How does Thompson react to this?
And I think people who are going to reject sampling are latent musos. They've used it because they have to, because that's what people expect, and now they want to get back into proving how good a musician they are, which is crap, you know. I've said it before, I mean, like, the sampler is one of the best toys that's ever come into the music industry. You know, if Hendrix was around now, he wouldn't just be, you know, if he was still cool, he'd be doing serious things with samplers. I mean, that's what he would have done. If he'd have come around at the time where samplers had come out, he would have been the man on the edge of sampling, you know? Wouldn't have just stuck with a guitar, but a guitar was his tool. That's the furthest out he could get at that time. The sampler's, you know, is out there, but that's the thing that can get you furthest out.
Hoodle and Priest are clearly optimistic about samplers and sample-based music, and all the evidence shows that more and more musicians, from George Michael to Napalm Death, are starting to use them. A new technology is just becoming available that will allow greater manipulation of samples than ever before, opening up even further creative possibilities. In the age of plunder, it seems virtually every musician will be pressing the record button.
But you are unlike me. The powers I hold will soon unfold as I tell you about a planet that can only be told by computer program. That's what I am, the bionic man. My mind's a rap scan. To say what I say can only be done by the memory banks in my brain, controlled by someone. The master himself, the hoodlum priest, has created a devastating masterpiece.
More human than you.
You've been listening to Can You Steal It? Presented by Pete Tong and produced by George Ergatoudis.